All right, so today we're diving into this documentary I found called "Poverty in the USA: Being Poor in the World's Richest Country."
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's on YouTube on the NDVR channel. Have you heard of that one?
Yeah, I think so.
It's pretty fascinating. It kind of digs into what life is like, below the poverty line here in the U.S. And I think there's a lot to unpack here. We hear so much about the American dream, but this documentary, really throws you into the reality.
Right. All right.
For so many people. So I thought it'd be good to just get into some of these stories and see what kind of insights we can pull out.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm always curious to see how these documentaries tackle the complexities of poverty.
Yeah. And I was telling you earlier, some of these stories, they really stuck with me, There's this one guy, he's a computer engineer in San Diego. You'd think, San Diego, beautiful place, good weather.
Right.
But he's living out of his car.
Wow.
And relying on donated pizza to survive. That's
wild. It really challenges your assumptions about who experiences poverty.
Exactly. And then you have this woman also in San Diego. She's working a job trying to keep things together, but she's living in a parking lot.
A parking lot.
Yeah. And then we go to Appalachia and you see this free dental clinic that feels more like something you'd see in a war zone just because the need is so overwhelming.
It's incredible how this documentary brings together these personal stories to shed light on the bigger picture.
Totally. Each individual is a window into these larger systems at play. Maria, the woman who's living in her van in San Diego, she's working 7 days a week.
7 days a week.
As a cleaner and caregiver, but still can't afford rent.
Yeah.
It's how much harder can you work?
That's heartbreaking. And it makes you wonder, what's the point of working so hard if you can't even afford basic housing?
Right. And she's not the only one.
Yeah.
The documentary shows how many people are just barely getting by, even with multiple jobs. And it makes you realize that poverty isn't just about individual choices. There are these structural issues at play.
Totally. It's about the systems that are set up in a way that makes it so difficult to escape poverty.
Exactly. And then there's Eric's story. He's the computer engineer I mentioned earlier. He actually had a good career, a stable life, but then burnout and health issues hit him, and he ended up homeless. It can happen to anyone. One unfortunate event can just completely derail your life.
It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable we all are, especially when you consider how inadequate our social safety net can be.
Yeah, it really makes you think about the systems in place and how they might be failing people who need them the most.
And speaking of systems, the documentary also takes us to Richmond, Virginia, where we meet David. He's a gardener, has a stable income, but he's stuck living in a motel room with his partner and kids, all because of past eviction records.
Right. That's something that really struck me, too. It's you can be doing everything right, working hard, making money, but those past mistakes can haunt you forever.
The documentary actually explains how this cycle of poverty works. Even if you can afford rent now, those eviction records can make it nearly impossible to find decent housing.
It's crazy. It's like a system designed to keep people down rather than lift them up.
And then the documentary explains how Virginia's eviction laws are set up in a way that heavily favors landlords.
I was shocked by those scenes of armed officers carrying out evictions. It just feels so dehumanizing.
Yeah, it's really hard to watch, and it raises questions about whether there are enough protections for tenants' rights.
It almost feels like the system is rigged against them.
It's clear that these laws can make it incredibly easy for people to fall into homelessness.
Right.
And once you're in that situation, it's even harder to get back on your feet.
It's like a vicious cycle that's so difficult to break.
And the documentary even mentions this database that landlords use to screen potential tenants. They can see your entire eviction history.
So even if you're trying to move on, that past follows you.
Exactly. It's like a permanent mark that makes it so much harder to find stable housing.
It's a good example of how something intended to protect landlords can actually end up perpetuating the cycle of poverty.
Right. It raises questions about fairness and second chances within the housing system, and whether we're really doing enough to help people escape these difficult situations.
Definitely something to think about.
For sure. Yeah, it really makes you think about how we can better support people who are struggling.
Absolutely. And the documentary goes on to explore food insecurity, which is a huge issue. And we see that firsthand in Appalachia with Sarenia. She's a former Marine living on a pension.
Oh, wow.
And she's trying to help her niece's family, too.
So she's really stretching those resources thin.
Yeah. And it's clear that food stamps are essential for her just to make ends meet.
Right.
And even then, she's still having to skip meals sometimes.
Yeah. It's tough to hear that, and it highlights how that generational cycle of poverty
Yeah.
can really impact families in places like Appalachia.
It's like this constant struggle to just put food on the table.
What I find particularly striking is how Cyrenia is relying on a system that's always under threat. Like,
Right.
politicians are constantly talking about cutting food stamp programs,
Yeah.
despite the fact that there's so much need in these communities.
Almost like a cruel irony, you know?
Yeah.
People are told to work hard and pull themselves up by their bootstraps.
Right.
But then the programs that are supposed to help them get there
Right.
are at risk of disappearing.
It really highlights a disconnect between the political rhetoric around poverty and the reality
Sure.
that people are facing on the ground.
And it's interesting that the documentary points out
Yeah.
that many people in these communities who are struggling actually voted for the politicians who are proposing these cuts.
It's a really complex issue, isn't it?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder what factors are influencing these voting decisions, and are people voting based on ideology or identity or a genuine understanding of how these policies are going to impact their lives?
Yeah, it's definitely not a simple issue.
Not at all. And I think this documentary does a good job of not pretending to have all the answers.
Yeah, it does.
But it really encourages us to think critically
Right.
about these issues and to engage in more open and honest conversations.
Absolutely. Speaking of challenging assumptions, there's this segment about a poverty simulation that takes place in Waco, Texas.
Interesting. I've heard of those.
Yeah, and it's an attempt to give people a taste of what it's like to live below the poverty line.
I think simulations like that can be valuable, for raising awareness. But I also think it's important to remember that they can only offer a very limited
Yeah,
and often sanitized version of the actual experience.
right. It's not the real deal.
Exactly. Like, you can't replicate the constant stress, the anxiety, the fear that comes with truly living in poverty.
Right. And even in this simulation, there are rules in place
Oh, really?
that sanitize the experience. Like, you can't beg for money or go dumpster diving, which are things that people facing real poverty often have to do.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that it's impossible to fully understand
Right.
what it's like to live in poverty without actually experiencing it firsthand.
Yeah, you can't truly grasp it from a simulation.
Exactly. But it's a good starting point.
Yeah, I think so.
It gets the conversation started.
Right. It gets people thinking.
And that's crucial for raising awareness and promoting understanding.
For sure. Now, one of the most impactful scenes for me was at that free medical clinic in Appalachia.
Yeah, that was powerful.
Seeing all those people waiting in line sometimes for days
Wow.
just to get basic dental care.
I can't imagine.
It was really moving.
It really highlights the healthcare disparities in this country.
Yeah, for sure.
For so many people living below the poverty line, basic dental care is simply out of reach.
And that can lead to even bigger health problems down the line.
Absolutely. I mean, those volunteer dentists were doing amazing work.
Yeah, they were.
But it's important to remember that relying on charity and volunteer work isn't a long-term solution.
Right. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
Exactly. And it raises questions about access to healthcare in general.
Yeah.
Should it be a fundamental right for everyone?
Right.
Or a privilege determined by how much money you make?
It's a tough question.
It is, but it's a question we need to be asking.
Absolutely. Now, the documentary doesn't just focus on the struggles.
Right.
It also introduces us to individuals who are trying to make a difference,
Like who?
like Punk Elvis in Los Angeles.
Punk Elvis.
Yeah, he's an activist who builds tiny houses for people experiencing homelessness.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
It's a small-scale solution, but it shows how much individuals can do to help.
I'm curious, what are these tiny houses like?
Well, he puts a lot of thought into them.
Okay.
They have alarms, solar panels, even designated addresses.
Wow, so they're not just like
Right.
basic shelter.
They're really well-designed spaces meant to give people a place to get back on their feet.
That's amazing. But it sounds like even his efforts faced some pushback.
Yeah, the documentary shows how he encountered resistance from both the city and some residents who didn't want these tiny houses in their neighborhoods.
It just goes to show that even when people are trying to do good, they often face obstacles.
And it highlights that stigma surrounding homelessness.
For sure, that not in my backyard mentality, that can make it so difficult to address this issue.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a complex issue for sure, but I think that's what makes this documentary so compelling.
Right, it forces you to confront these uncomfortable truths and to really think about what role we play in either perpetuating or addressing these problems.
And it's not about blaming individuals.
Right.
It's about understanding the larger forces at play, the systemic issues that create these cycles of poverty.
Exactly like with Punk Elvis. His story shows how one person can actually make a difference.
Right, even if it's on a small scale.
Yeah. And he's not just giving people a place to stay.
Right.
He's putting so much thought into these tiny houses.
Yeah. What else did he do?
Like he makes sure they have alarms, solar panels, designated addresses.
That's incredible. He's really thinking about their dignity.
Right. It's about restoring a sense of agency.
Yeah, it's not just a handout.
It's about giving them the tools to rebuild their lives.
Exactly. But even with those good intentions, he still faces resistance.
Yeah, it's not easy.
It's a reminder that we have a long way to go in terms of changing our perceptions about homelessness.
And dismantling that not in my backyard mentality.
Absolutely. It's going to take a collective effort to really create lasting change.
So where do we go from here? We've gone through all these stories of these complex issues. What's the takeaway?
I think the biggest takeaway is that poverty in America is a very real and pressing issue.
Yeah.
It's not just about individual choices or shortcomings.
Right.
It's about a system that's often failing the people who need it the most.
Yeah. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Like, what can one person do?
I get that, but I think this documentary shows that even small actions can make a difference.
I agree.
Like supporting organizations working on the front lines, volunteering your time, advocating for better policies.
Absolutely. Every little bit helps.
And it's about educating ourselves.
Yeah.
Challenging our own assumptions.
Right.
And having those uncomfortable conversations.
Because change starts with awareness.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that poverty is a systemic issue.
Yeah.
It's not just a personal failing.
Right. And we need to work together to create a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. Where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Well said.
This documentary leaves us with a powerful question.
Yeah. What's that?
What role are we willing to play in building that better future?
It's a question we all need to ask ourselves.
For sure.
Well, thanks for joining me for this deep dive. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Absolutely. I'm glad we had this discussion.
Yeah, me too. And